Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining for episode 21 of Meet Me for Coffee today. I just realized that the next show in 2 weeks is going to be in October, which means it's like basically the end of the year already. I don't know. That's how my mind works. It's like once you get into the burrs, like October, November, December, it's like we might as well just call it January. So excited to have an amazing guest join us today. I'm going to go ahead and bring in Crystal Anderson. She is the Director of North American Distribution Logistics at Ingredion. I think I got that right. Good morning, Crystal.
Hey, good morning, Samantha. How are you?
I am doing great. I will say though, it's definitely like a true meet me for coffee day where I'm like needed a couple cups of coffee to keep me moving this morning. So there
Yes.
you go. We both got our coffee for sure. You are in Chicago, correct? You're in that
Yeah.
area.
Rainy Chicago today. We do not have nice weather, but typically this time of year, it's very nice to come visit. And also the place where you and I met last year at JOC Inland.
Yes, I was gonna say we're gonna have to like give a shout out to that because almost exactly a year ago today, you and I met at the JOC Inland Distribution Conference,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
is, I believe it is this coming Monday through Wednesday
Hmm.
in Chicago. I'm
Yes.
sure you could still register if anybody's listening that wants to look into it. It was a really great conference. Crystal and I both got to speak there last year, and that is, as fate would have it, what connected us and how we got to get to know each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Crystal, can you please go ahead and I mean, obviously we've known each other for a year now, so we've connected, but can you share with the audience just real quick your background in the industry and kind of where you're at now and what you currently do?
Yeah, absolutely. I have been in the supply chain industry for over 10 years now, almost 15, I guess we're coming up on. I'm a graduate of Northern Illinois University, so go Huskies, and have really been in the CPG industry since my graduation. So, have always been in the logistics functional area of supply chain. And recently, about October of last year, so just coming up on a year on that too, started leading a new functional area within our supply chain for distribution. So it always used to be a part of logistics. We broke it out and made it its own area, and I'm really proud of the team that's running it today. So
I do have to ask, when you were in college, did you study logistics or did you think that's what you were going to
I
do?
did. Yeah, so I didn't initially. I thought I was going to be an accountant, and I got into accounting. It's funny, I just had a conversation with our cost accountant yesterday about this, where I very quickly realized that accounting was not for me, but that's okay.
Yeah.
And found a transfer program that was for, it's called OMIS, OM&IS. So it's
Okay.
Operations Management and Information Systems. And the thought behind it is that as really well-rounded supply chain professionals, you need to, if you want to focus in operations management, you really have to have that background in IS to understand how to liaison with those
Okay.
colleagues. And then same on the other side, right? If you really want to be a strong IT professional in business, you have to know the OM side of the business. So you major in one and background in the other, and it was a great program. Highly
That's
recommend it.
really interesting because I was an operations management major. Um,
Yeah,
we did nothing about information systems and I can
yeah,
totally see why that would make sense now because just because I
yeah,
understand some functions of operations doesn't mean that I understand how all the systems work, and in fact I'm terrible at
absolutely.
technology, so I guess that's why I
Yeah,
ended
it
up
makes
in
those conversations a lot easier. Like when you are working on the technical side of things and why things aren't flowing well, it helps with that. So
yeah,
highly recommend
and
it if anybody's
especially in supply
interested.
chain, like how many times do we hear the words WMS, ERP, all of these TMS, all of these acronyms for software
Hmm.
systems that you never touch on in school. So anyway,
Yeah,
I guess 10 to 15 years of experience outside of
yeah,
college has done us well there too. So um,
absolutely.
Crystal, I one of my favorite things about your background is that I don't meet a whole lot of people who have done transportation, like the actual logistics transportation piece of supply chain, which is more what
Sure.
the industry that I spend my time in on the actual, truck procurement and transportation side,
Mhm.
but then also have like a good understanding of warehouse operations and distribution. And I've always kind of
Mhm.
found that sometimes it can be fragmented within companies where maybe transportation doesn't necessarily know what warehouse or distribution is doing, and distribution doesn't really know what
Mhm.
transportation is doing. So I think it's really cool that
Yeah.
you have done both sides and at the same company at that. So I want to talk about both of them, but let's talk about transportation first because that's kind of where you
Sure.
started with Ingredion. Um,
Mhm.
I know that you led logistics through the pandemic. I mean, and the sustained environment that was the pandemic for the last few years. So I don't want to talk about, I think everybody's a little tired of talking about just the pandemic, but I want to talk
Mm-hmm.
about what it was like managing logistics and transportation in just a very sustained, like, stressful environment for transportation and
Mm-hmm.
logistics. And then what has changed in just the last kind of, everybody's felt the shift in the last year or two. So what
Mm-hmm.
do you think, like, what was it like then? What were some of the things that were different when it came to managing logistics and transportation? And then as it shifted into a different type of environment feel the last year and a half, like now what is the focus and what does that feel like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we can all agree, anybody that was in the industry last year, almost regardless of what functional area of supply chain you were in, we were all feeling it. And honestly, the teams that came out on top were the teams that really banded together and created the capability together, either before or during the situation, so that we could be successful on the outcome side. I would say that if you didn't already know it before, there's a lot of different, well, everyone knows this, there's a lot of different approaches to procurement. But before COVID, if you didn't know it, relationships are absolutely key. And I think that definitely helped us a lot. Certainly, we have situations where we are driving for cost and we have to make sure that we're balancing cost and
Right.
service. Um, but carriers remember, and so do shippers. The tables always turn. It's cyclical, right? It's a cyclical
Right.
market.
That it is.
So when you can, yeah, absolutely. And so when you can preserve those relationships and create long-term strategic partnerships versus just transactional relationships with those providers, even if you have transactional business, doesn't mean that you can't create long-term partnerships with those providers. And I think if you had those types of relationships going into what we saw over the past couple of years, you definitely fared a little bit better than maybe some of your competition. This year, we're definitely seeing improvement across the supply chain. Distribution, as a lot of us know, over last year, the square footage was really tight. Trucks were tight, obviously. Labor was tight. You can, even if you could get the building, it wasn't a guarantee that you can get people to get in there and
Yeah.
do the forklift work, right? So we're definitely seeing that loosen up this year. But I think all of us, like, are a little sensitive and we don't want to just assume that everything's going to be okay going forward. And I remember speaking with a counterpart, I guess an industry colleague at a customer advisory board last year, for a Fortune 50 company. And he said, a lot of people don't realize that this is the time that you do your planning. This is the
Right.
time that you make the investments in the partnerships or the dedicated fleet or the equipment or whatever that is. This is the time that you do it. So you don't want to do it in the middle of it. And I mean, obviously, that sounds very logical, right? But I also think necessity is the mother of invention. So not everyone's always thinking about that when things are, a little bit more comfortable from an industry standpoint. So I think we are not totally waiting for the other shoe, or I guess I should say, I'm not totally waiting for the other shoe to
Right.
drop in terms of industry shift, but it will shift. It's cyclical. It'll always come back. So what are you doing now to prepare for if capacity gets tighter and when it
Right.
does?
Um, First of all, I'm just going to extend this like another 30 minutes because you're going to say so many good things and we're just going to have to keep talking. So everybody's listening right now, like, oh my gosh, she's so smart. But I love what you
Yeah.
said about it instantly stuck out to me because you said even if you have transactional business, you can still have partnerships. Oh my
Yes.
gosh, because I've heard so many shippers who are like, well, we're seasonal. Well, we have short lead times. Well, like lower volume lanes, or like they make
Hmm.
excuses for why you can't still find the right partner to commit to that, to commit to a
Hmm.
unique type of partnership. And it's like the beauty of this is like there is no like one size fits all in transportation. And there's so many different providers out
Mm-mm.
there that if your focus is on partnerships, you'll find the right fit even for a more transactional business model. And it's some
Hmm.
industries it's by necessity, like it's just
Hmm.
the industry you service and how it works sometimes. And sure, almost every shipper
Hmm.
is going to have those high density, like high volume lanes and great metros, but a a lot of your business is going to be a little non-traditional, a little bit unique, and you can still find a partner for that and keep that in a more secure place. I love that call out. That's so true, but it just takes the focus and the emphasis on those relationships.
Absolutely. We have a procurement, I wouldn't, slogan maybe would
like a
be the right way
motto,
to say it. But you have to take the meat with the bones, meaning not every lane you get awarded is going to be a power lane. And that goes from the shipper side and that goes from the carrier side, right? So you have to have those agreements in place for service, to make sure that, hey, we're placing this award, we're expecting you to service it. This is our commitment to you. I'm a big believer that if you're contracted for a set of time, whether it's 6, 9, 12 months, stick to that contract.
Right.
You've committed that to your carrier. That's a part of your relationship management. You can absolutely go back and chase rates if you see dips in the market, right? You can go back and do another RFP mid-cycle and break your contract. But you have to remember that your carriers are going to remember that, and they can do the same thing in their cycles too. So there's definitely trade-offs, and we have to always be kind of forward-looking and understand what that impact is, not just today, but longer term.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so talked a little about transportation and logistics. Now let's talk a little bit about distribution, because like you said, you guys kind of created like a new team focused on distribution. And so just kind of talk to me about like, what is that? What has that been like? What is the goal? What is kind of the emphasis and the focus of the team that you're on right now?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately the goal is continuing to build capability maturity. That's a Gartner term. They do capability maturity assessments for capability maturity. They do assessments for supply chains. It's something that I learned quite a few years ago when we were doing our first assessment for ourselves in logistics. And so I think we recognize an opportunity to be better. And if you resource it, it will get done. So that's our goal. We want to create a team. We want to build best practices, continue to build on those best practices that are already existing. Obviously, we pride ourselves in servicing our customers today, so we only want to make that better from what it is already. And it's not an overnight journey. It's not a 3-month journey or a 6-month journey. You have to start at the bottom. You have to start at the fundamentals, the rudimentary type of stuff. Like, do we have the right data sources? Do we have all the information that we need from our partners? Do we have the information that we need internally to help partner with our partners, right? Do we have the forecasting tools, and making sure that we're working through all of that very systematically to make sure that we can create not just capability today, but what I like to say is sustainable capability. And I think sustainability is obviously this keyword that we hear in the industry a lot, but more so from, can you create a process that will grow with the business? And so not anything that you create today is going to be what it should be in 5 years. And you have to enable that in the process development, right? You have to enable it to be able to grow and change with the business. And I think that's a big piece of it when we think about, in any area of business. It could be finance, it could be marketing. Is what you're doing today repeatable? Could someone else do it? And is it modifiable? Could someone come in 3 years and say, hey, I see some great ideas based off of other things that I've done in my past. I think we can make this better, but you have to make that process moldable for the future too. So that's the sustainability piece of it.
I love that. Sustainable, I believe, is in like my headline on LinkedIn, because I'm with you. I think we're aligned on what that means. And there's a lot of talk about sustainability right now as far as like ESG initiatives, but I'm talking about same as you. Like, are the processes that you are putting in place to run a business sustainable? Or do they make sense? Is it profitable in a way that makes sense? If you have processes in place, and your business is doing a lot of great things, and you're, on our side of the industry, if you're not producing revenue and profits, and you're not growing, then it's not sustainable. It might work to accomplish a certain goal, but it's not sustainable. So I'm always kind of on that side of like sustainable revenue growth, sustainable processes. I do say, I'll tell on myself a little bit that sometimes I'm one of those people who tends to think about like, yes, but in 5 years, here's where, and I'm like, okay, but it's also 2023. So like, let's make sure we're focused on right now too. And not just, is this going to be good in 5 years? Is it good today too? So there's there's
Yeah.
stepping stones to that, but I love that call out on the sustainable side of the
Yeah.
processes.
It,
Okay,
yeah, absolutely.
I remembered that when you spoke at JOC last year, and I got to listen to you, you talked a lot about data and kind of like
I
data
did.
driven decision making within, you were
Yeah.
still in logistics and transportation at that time. But I'm curious to know, as you're kind of getting more cross functional across your organization and on the distribution side, is data still playing a role in what you guys are doing on the distribution side? And what does that look like?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, data's hard because I feel like it's almost become overused. Like everyone says data, everyone says it. Do we have the data? And I think it's almost overused to the point where people oversimplify it. And that's dangerous
Yeah,
because if you don't actually spend the time doing that data validation, making sure that what you have in front of you and what you're using for your analysis is good information, and
right.
that those processes that you're using with your system support that data validation sustainably, right? You have to make sure that you have processes to validate that data regularly, whether, depending on what it is, you have to have cadences around that. Um, and I think if you're not making decisions with data in 2023, you're only working subjectively. And I've done a lot of personal work to try and be less subjective about how I approach things. I think I get really passionate about things that I work on, and that automatically kind of ties into some emotions. I regularly tell myself, all right, let's take a step back. Let's look at the numbers. Let's understand where the numbers are coming from, how the numbers are maintained, so that we can make a really educated decision. I'm also in the school of thought that data doesn't always tell the full picture. And so you have to have interviews and understanding from those people who are managing the process to make sure, and that's kind of part of your data validation process, to make sure that what you're using is good information. If you want to do an RFP, I mean, you could pull in obviously your current cost, right? You're going to pull in your cost from what you're procuring from your carriers for that RFP. You can pull in service metrics if those are pre-existing incumbent lanes and see how they've been performing, like primary tender acceptance, on-time delivery. But there's also an ease of doing business part of it too, right? And so if our team is having to work harder on a regular basis to maintain a relationship with a carrier, does that truly benefit both organizations? And so while that type of feedback, that subjective feedback, shouldn't necessarily drive your decision making in your procurement exercise, it does need to be considered and evaluated as you're monitoring those relationships on an annual or multi-annual basis.
Right. Yeah, I love what you said right at the beginning too about how um it's just subjective if you're not using the right type of data or clean data. I think that goes, both ways too. And working in a smaller company and being a lot closer now to the data, I've seen that happen as well, where um,
Mm-hmm.
not all things are equal. Like numbers on one account, you for instance, let's say profitability or revenue percentages
Mm-hmm.
for one of our customers might be acceptable at a lower number, where it's not just saying like, oh, they all have to be exactly the same. Well, it depends, like on, like you said, what type of resources are we putting into that, what type of work is going into that. We have some that are in specialized industries, and there's a lot more manpower that has to go into that. And so you just have to be able to kind of do that cost trade-off analysis, essentially. Like, if you have to be able to take that data and use it in a way that makes informed decisions, but then also making
Mm-hmm.
sure the data is working for you. We've had to get pretty unique with finding ways to like add certain fields in certain processes that we have, where we're able to have our operations specialists select certain things so that we can go back and look at that later and be like, why was it this way, or was it this type of load or this type of load?
Mm-hmm.
So again, just making sure that you're putting, I think, that upfront emphasis on, are we setting up the processes to collect clean data? Is it going to be workable data?
Yep.
Before you worry about what am I doing with the data once I get it. What do you think about
100%.
data when it comes to like a people management standpoint? Because we've kind of had some things there too, where it's like, well, what is the data telling us about performance, or is the role a right fit, or are we doing this, are we enabling these people, or just there's a variety of things I think we could start to maybe use data a little bit more when it comes to how we're leading and managing people. But I'd be curious to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I think we're close to that. I don't know. I don't know how much. I think you're still going to have some swag in those data sets, and some of that comes on how you brought up specialized transport, right? So if you've got a resource on your team that's working on specialized transport, that may be a very different effort than someone who's working on automated RFP tenders where all primary tenders go out and they're only dealing with rejections or exception-based
Yeah.
management. And so I think it can be challenging to gauge people if you have differentiation in what they're working on. What I really like to look for in terms of data and my team is how willing are they to dig in and understand the data and make sure that the processes that collect the data are on point where they need to be. Do we have gaps in the process? And what I like to look at is what I've learned as the unattainable triangle, which is cost, service, and quality. Typically, I mean, ideally, let's start with ideally, you want to find that perfect balance right in the middle of the triangle. But we all know that
Right.
that's why it's called the unattainable triangle. It's you basically can't do that, right? So you kind of pick the two where you really need to play, excuse me, and then one is always going to be sacrificed a little bit. So if cost and service are really important to you, you might sacrifice quality a little bit. And if cost and quality are really important to you, you might sacrifice service a little bit. So as you think about that, it also comes down to people, process, and technology. So if you don't have the technology to support the process, or if you don't have the process to support the technology, like one cannot really exist well without the other two. And that's where that people point comes into it. If those people don't have the tools available to them to manage the process well or to manage the technology well, that's on us as leaders to make sure that we're enabling
Right.
that capability and enabling that performance for our team. So, I mean, in 10, 15, 20 years, do I imagine where you have a dashboard in front of you and you can see, you know, live stats of your team? Yeah, potentially. But I think, again, assuming that everything will be 100% standardized in that team's workload, that always is kind of your differentiator and your
I
challenge
think
there. So I like to look and see if people are accepting and willing to dig into the data.
yes. And I also think like a great call out on data when it comes to like a service driven industry, right? It's like everybody's role is so unique that it's hard to really put like a metric on that. When you're, I think of like an assembly line or assembly plant, when like you have someone producing X quantity of whatever it is every day, and like there's different ways that you can use data, right, to manage or to understand what's going on with people. I think for us it's more just proven to be like a good starting point for conversations where it's like maybe something in our process isn't really that efficient right here. If on Wednesdays we struggle more with this because maybe it's on Wednesdays we're shorter staffed or we typically get more shipments that hit over on Wednesdays when we have two people out on lunch. Like you just never know. Like there could be many
Yeah.
ways to look at that. But I think that at the end of the day, one of my favorite things to say about data is that data can remove unnecessary emotions from decision making, where a lot of people, especially in transportation, being on the sales side, I've talked to so many shippers and I always hear the words just feel like they don't when they're talking about providers. It's like, I feel like they always, and it's always the always and the nevers and like those words that
Yeah.
aren't true, right? Like always, never, like
Yeah.
these things. But I feel like this. And that's because it's so difficult when something causes a problem or when something stands out. That
Mhm.
one instance stood out, but the thousand good ones that had no issues don't. And so I think that that's when it like requires digging into things because we can tend to make emotional decisions. So we're humans when it comes to certain things that feel a certain way rather than if we look at the data, are they really like that a majority of the time or a meaningful amount of the time?
Yep.
So I love that.
Absolutely.
So I do have to ask you because I've had quite a few guests on the show so far. I'm pretty heavy in economics and just industry experts. And those people don't always have to necessarily lead and manage people. I kind of
Sure.
get some more like data guys behind the scenes on here, but I think it's unique that you have years of experience managing teams, both in transportation and distribution. So I'd love to just kind of get your thoughts on leadership, like especially over the
Yeah.
last 2 years, and now as we're kind of moving forward. I mean, we went through work from home, hybrid, like we're like so
Yeah.
much has changed. Like I literally remember in
Yeah.
2020, I had never used Microsoft Teams or any type of virtual meeting platform, and so now it's like second nature.
You
But
do now.
talk to me about leading,
Yeah.
leading teams through the last several years and what you've learned and some of the things that,
Yeah.
you kind of stand out to you that you would recommend.
Yeah. That's such a good question. I still think of myself as a new leader. And I think part of that is because I always just want to learn. I'm always out to like, there's always going to be something different. I always want to learn more about being a better leader. I try to be very reflective about how what I do as a leader affects our colleagues, affects our teams. I'm certainly not perfect in any of those areas. I have a lot of opportunity in front of me. But I think as I think about last year, for leadership, everyone that I knew was kind of working like at least a level or two below them. Like at least we were all firefighting to a certain extent. We were all, much
Yeah.
further in the weeds than I think our leaders would have wanted us to be. And that takes a lot of time away, and it's a different.
Yep.
It's a lot of energy that you're spending towards managing the business versus working on the business and working with your teams and
Yes.
working on development. So I definitely recognize that past couple of years were more challenging from a leadership perspective for me personally. And I grew from that. I learned a lot. And I, kind of told myself this year, I want to get deeper into spending time with people within my team that are really close to my team, understanding what's important, understanding what they see as opportunities, because there's a completely different perspective at other areas of the business. And something that I've learned the hard way that I didn't agree with when I first heard it is that perception is reality. And
Yes.
it was really hard because I was like, no, reality is reality. No, perception is reality. Because if you are unable as a leader to help others understand, what the outcomes are, what the process is, whatever it is, right, that you're trying to help message, then their reality is not your impact. And so I've been working a lot on intent versus impact. What did I intend to do versus what was my
Oh,
actual
yeah.
impact? And I've almost gotten to the point where intention doesn't matter anymore. I'm trying not to be too hard on that though, because I think people are generally good intended as they're approaching all things in life. But what is the ultimate impact of what those intentions are? So my intent this year is to be a better leader and connect with my team and learn more just about them and what's important to them from a personal level, from a professional level, where they want to grow and develop, what they see as opportunities within the business. And my intent for that impact is that we can build a stronger team by having those deeper relationships. We're going back to that keyword, relationships within our own structure,
Yeah, go
to make
figure
sure that we can work
relationships.
successfully together.
Yeah, go figure that those things matter in a company and with your external partners too. Like
Yeah,
who would have thought?
yeah,
But I
couldn't
love
have said.
that. I mean, the perception is reality. I think that I probably haven't fully accepted that, and that can be a hard pill for some of us to swallow. I have a feeling you and I are a little bit similar in the fact that we're just kind of like, say it like it is, like give it to me straight, like I'm not going to be offended whatsoever. It's just kind of who I am as a person. But I know that um, I was working one time on a team with a few people, and like honestly, we were just so different. Like that's what it came down to. And somebody like made us take a step back and take like that personality test. Um,
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
and when I read it about the person that I was like having so much frustration with, I read their results on like how they want to be communicated to and how they communicate. I was like, oh my gosh, it's them. And then I read like how it instantly clicked, like how I'm not being helpful whatsoever in the way that I was approaching that person. And I think that that takes
Yeah.
a very self-aware person. And I think that that's a big part of leadership, right? Is being very self-aware that, like, sure, you are a certain type of way. Like, you have your own unique personality. And the interesting thing to me is that a lot of things that society and just business in general says make a person a good leader is like this really strong individual personality and like a certain type of charismatic qualities or the way that they analyze things and the way that they get things done. But then when you look at the people who just everybody else, anyone working in the industry, there's so many types of personalities that are going to fall under those leaders. And I think naturally we tend to be drivers and doers, and you just have to take a step back and realize like that works well in certain situations, but as a leader now, it's not just about you getting things done, it's about helping enable your employees to get things done. And
Yes.
there are so many personality types, and it just, like I said, self-aware and I mean intent, really, like intent, because you're going to have to make a conscious effort for like, I know that, you know, Jake is this type of way. And so I'm going to have to do this. And it might feel awkward to me, but I'm telling you, I did it. I started like presenting this like to this individual when I talked to them, started changing the way I led meetings. And, you know, I'm kind of like, get in, get going, let's get it done. And I read in this person's personality that they want to talk for 5 to 10 minutes about how their weekend was and feel like they're connecting with you. And I was like, all right, it's what we're doing. And it made a world of difference. It's like these little things that make such a big difference. And at the end of the day, I think you enjoy it more too. Like even if it feels awkward at first, right? It works out better for you too in that partnership, in that relationship.
Absolutely. 1,000%. Yeah, I would. That's such a good point, is the personality assessment, because I my mom would tell me, not everyone thinks the same way that you do, Crystal. When I was
My mom says that
younger,
too.
obviously. And I'm like, but it's just faster this way, Mom. And they're like, but she's like, but sometimes it doesn't matter how fast you go. It matters that you get to the same endpoint. And so
Wow, yeah.
definitely have had some great, great learnings. I think we can all agree none of us are the same person today that we were the person we were 10 years ago. And so definitely understanding that people, like, I want to grow, I want to get better, I want to do things better. I anticipate to some extent that everyone else wants to do that too. So just because you had a bad interaction with someone, you know, a few years ago, doesn't mean that you are going to have that every single time that you interact with them. They may be working on their own personal growth and development and trying to
Absolutely.
get better. And then you working on your own in parallel is only going to help those interactions get better. So,
Yes. I love that. Well, I have a couple, like a wrap up question here. Somehow we're already getting past time, but I want
oh
to
my
ask
gosh, it
you,
went so fast.
I mean, it does. It goes so fast. And I told you at the beginning we were just going to extend it. So maybe we'll just keep going. But one last question for you as we are. I actually joked about this at the beginning of the call, but I'm serious. Once we get to like September, October, I'm like, the year is basically over because everything's going to go so
Yeah.
fast, right? We have so much time that people
Yep.
will be out for holidays. Like you know, you have just
Mhm.
everything just seems to move so quickly when we get to the end of the year. So as
Mhm.
we're starting to think about wrapping up 2023, moving into 2024, which does sound a little crazy to
Mhm.
say. But what do you think,
Mhm.
just being on the shipper side in this market, like you said, you recognize that there's changes, that it can be cyclical. What do you think that the focus is going to be to get through the end of 2023, and then to just make sure you're prepared, and what the emphasis will be, what the theme of 2024 is, if you will? Like, how do you see that
Yeah.
going?
Oh, that's such a good question, Samantha. And it's very reminiscent of JOC last year, because I think that
Yeah.
was the last question that they asked the panel that we participated on. And I think most were calling for recession, and I don't know that we've seen a full recession yet. And my response to that question last year was, if it is a recession, it's going to be the oddest one that we've ever seen.
Yep.
And I think that's I mean, I'm no Nostradamus, but it's just been so odd. There is no. I mean, we used to these like very cyclical cycles, right? You follow the indices like Morgan Stanley or Drury or whatever is out there, right, for your industry and your index that you use. Um, it's kind of out the window recently. And so this kind of goes back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier, where like we're kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop, but you can't wait for it to drop, right? You have to do that planning in anticipation of it. So there's definitely been a little bit of tightening, I think, out there from what we've seen, but nothing that, I mean, it's nowhere close to what we've dealt with in like the 2018 freight
Right.
crisis where ELD requirements was coming in, right? And then the COVID crisis where you just couldn't find a driver for anything. So I don't think we're back to that. I'm really interested to understand. I think there's some autonomous truck uh, startups, and I've seen a couple keep going. I've seen a couple kind of drop off because of funding. But I think ultimately, truck driving is a tough job. You're away from family, and if you really don't want to be independent, 24/7, it's not an easy livelihood. And so we as a society, especially as we think about, there's a lot of people who aren't raising their kids to be truck drivers. That used to be back in the 80s,
Right.
a very looked up to role, and it's changed a lot over the years. And I think we have to think about ways as an industry to continue to like make that easier for all of us as shippers and carriers. Not just like, I'm not just talking like driver lounges, right? Like that's table stakes anymore. Like you have
Right.
guys something to eat, drink, and a place to relax. But I think as we think about the future and going into next year, I certainly expect a little bit of tightening after how much how loose it's been over the past 12 to 16 months. And this goes for the distribution labor market too. But I'm really interested to see where automation continues to go, and how that can play a part in how this industry really matures itself over the next 5 to 10 years. So I can't make any uh, economist calls on this, Samantha, but as long as shippers and carriers are doing the work now to get the forecasts locked
Right.
in, to understand what your margin of error is or bias is on those forecasts,
Yes.
do that work now, because the better you can plan, the more informed you can make those relationships. It's not just the relationship, it's also information sharing. Ultimately, the more successful you're going to be throughout any market condition that you run into.
Yeah, I love that. Such good call outs. I have to say that on the autonomous side and how do we get better as an industry, one of the things I've called out that I think that's going to be a continued trend is this shift from we create the necessity for long haul over the road trucking by having these
Mm-hmm.
supply chains that are so dependent on one or two locations or one major port.
Mm-hmm.
But I have seen so
Yep.
much progress in the last few years for diversifying a supply chain to have
Mm-hmm.
multiple ports that they call for imports, we're shifting to regionalized distribution centers. When we start getting everything
Mm-hmm.
regionalized, there is no more,
Yes.
1,000, mile runs
Yes.
anymore. That's how we improve the livelihood for drivers, is saying, go home every night,
Mm-hmm.
make your runs,
Mm-hmm.
spend 8 hours in a truck, 10 hours on shift, whatever it is, running these regionalized networks, or maybe you're gone one night or 2 nights. But I think it's
Yeah,
the progress towards
absolutely.
making it more friendly for truckers, but also at the end of the day, it's, we'd be lying to ourselves if we said the only reason the industry was progressing like that was because it was helping our drivers, right? It's because there's
Yeah.
cost savings
Oh,
for the
yeah.
businesses. There's a increase in the speed in which you can get your goods to your consumers. So there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
positives for both the shippers and the transportation providers, I think, in this shift towards
Mm-hmm.
more regionalized
Oh,
distribution.
yeah.
On that note, I wanted to bring that up because I think that autonomous trucking has a lot of challenges, but I think it has the best chance to succeed when you're reducing the distance on those lanes. So I think it's
Mm-hmm.
complementary too to the autonomous efforts that we're seeing. Um,
Oh,
so
absolutely. And ultimately, when you think about that, Samantha, if you're doing a long haul truck, more often than not, it probably comes down to poor planning too. Because if you had the opportunity to run that intermodal, right, or you had the
mm,
opportunity to run that consolidation, and that's where it comes to this like information sharing and this pre-planning. I like to think of the analogy of like your pantry, right? If you took the time every week or every 2 weeks to walk through and think about every ingredient you were going to need, and what you were going to cook on what nights and when you were going to eat leftovers, and line that up with your sports schedule and your after school schedule. Like if we actually, as professionals, had the time, I don't have the time, some people might, but
If we tried to actually be power moms, it would go better for us, is what you're saying.
Yeah. If I had the time to do that level of planning on a regular basis and maintain that, I would have zero food waste in my household. I mean, we would significantly reduce food waste in the United States, and end consumer food waste drives supply chain inflation, right? So because you need more product to actually feed the people that you're doing on the inside. So that's kind of the easiest simplification that I've been able to think of that affects every single person. So if you're not a logistics or supply chain subject matter expert, just think about your pantry and how you manage your pantry, and that is your own little mini supply chain that you're planning
so
for.
True. It's the lifeblood of the home, and it's a critical one. So yeah, no, I love that analogy. Well, Crystal, we went over time. I don't care at all because this was such a great conversation. I'm so happy that you joined us. Thank you so much for coming on this morning, and I'm sure we'll be in touch soon. But if anybody would like to ask Crystal any questions, drop them in the comments. No matter when you're listening to this, she can always jump back and respond there, or connect with her on LinkedIn and shoot her a message there too. Thanks everybody for joining us for coffee today.